She built an empire worth billions and had no idea the man mopping the lobby floor had already saved her life once before. The night they put a black bag over Celeste Armitage's head and threw her into the back of a van, she was certain of one thing: nobody was coming for her. Her security team was compromised. Her phone was gone. And the only man who knew where she was, the quiet, unremarkable husband she had spent 3 years pretending didn't exist, was supposed to be home tucking his 8-year-old daughter into bed. She was wrong about all of it. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit that like button and drop a comment below telling me the city and country where you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what happens next will change everything you think you know about the people standing quietly beside you. The rain came in sideways that night, the kind that didn't fall so much as attack, driving itself against the glass tower of Armitage Vanguard headquarters like it had a personal grievance with the building. Most of the city had already surrendered to it, retreating indoors, and by midnight the plaza surrounding the tower was empty, except for the bronze sculptures that nobody had ever asked for, and the security camera housings that, as of 11:47 that evening, had quietly stopped recording. Celeste Armitage didn't know that last part yet. She was on the 41st floor, still at her desk at 12:15, because the meeting with the Pentagon liaison had run 4 hours over schedule and left her with 230 pages of contract language that needed her eyes before 7 the next morning. Her assistant had gone home at 9. The cleaning crew had swept through at 10. By midnight, the entire executive floor felt like the inside of a museum after closing still, expensive, and profoundly indifferent to human presence. She reached for a jacket at 12:22. She remembered that detail later with the specific clarity that comes when the brain understands, on some animal level, that a moment matters. 12:22. She rode the executive elevator down alone, watching her own reflection in the polished doors without particular interest. The woman looking back at her was 30 years old and looked 40. Not in terms of appearance. Her appearance was something she managed the way she managed quarterly projections, with discipline and without sentiment but in the eyes. There was a tiredness there that concealer and good lighting couldn't touch. The kind that accumulated not from working too hard, but from working in a way that left no room for anything else. She stepped out into the underground parking level at 12:29, her heels producing crisp, deliberate echoes against the concrete. Her car was positioned in the reserved bay nearest the elevator, exactly where it always was, exactly as her security protocols required. The two men were already there. She registered them a half-second before they moved 2 figures, stepping out from between the parked vehicles with the coordinated mechanical efficiency of people who had rehearsed this, and then something came down over her head from behind, thick fabric cutting off light and most of the sound, and hands that were enormous and very strong closed around her upper arms, and the world tilted sideways. She fought. That was worth noting. She was not someone who went quietly. She drove an elbow backward and connected with something solid, heard a grunt, and managed half a scream before a hand covered the fabric over her mouth, and someone said, close to her ear, with a tone of absolute professionalism, "Stop. We're not here to hurt you. Stop moving." She didn't stop moving. But there were 3 of them, she understood, as they loaded her into something that smelled of industrial rubber and motor oil, and 3 against 1, in the dark, with her hands already being secured. That was math that didn't work in her favor, no matter how much she refused to accept it. The vehicle moved. She counted seconds. She tried to track turns. She made herself breathe through her nose slowly, because panic was a resource drain, and she could not afford it. Outside the bag, the men said almost nothing to each other, which was worse than if they'd talked, somehow. Amateurs talked. These 3 communicated in the specific silence of people who didn't need words to coordinate. The warehouse they brought her to smelled like rust and standing water and something chemical she couldn't identify. They removed the bag but left the zip ties on her wrists and sat her in a metal folding chair under a single work light that threw harsh shadows in every direction. The space was vast enough that the walls were mostly darkness, interrupted by the occasional shape of old machinery covered in canvas. There were 3 of them. The one who had spoken to her in the parking garage, square-jawed, perhaps 45, with the kind of posture that didn't happen without years of formal training, seemed to be in charge. The other 2 were younger. They all wore nondescript clothing and gloves, and none of them had made any attempt to conceal their faces, which Celeste noted and filed away as information that could mean several things, none of them particularly good. "We're waiting for a call," the square-jawed man said, as though this explained everything. "Whose call?" Celeste said. "That's not something you need to know right now." "I own the company your employers are trying to move against," she said, keeping her voice flat. "Whatever they think they're accomplishing with this, they've misread the contract timeline. The Defense Committee review happens in—" "Ms. Armitage," he said, with the practiced patience of someone who had waited out harder people than her, "you don't need to negotiate right now. Just sit." She sat, not because he told her to, because she was listening. There were sounds she could identify: rain against metal roofing, the distant passage of vehicles on what sounded like a highway, water dripping somewhere in the back of the space, and sounds she couldn't. And she was trying to build a picture of where she was and what exits existed and what her actual options were. And the honest answer to that last part was very few. Her phone was in a Faraday bag one of the men carried. Her security detail, 2 men who should have been on shift, were not here. She didn't know yet whether they were compromised, incapacitated, or worse. The internal security protocols she had personally overseen for 3 years had failed completely. Someone had turned off the cameras. Someone had known her schedule. Someone on the inside had handed her over. That realization sat in her chest like something cold and heavy. The loneliness of it was almost physical. She had spent a decade building the walls of her professional life, high enough that nothing could get through them, and those same walls had just become the architecture of her trap. She thought briefly of Ronan. The thought was almost irritating in its irrelevance. Ronan Vale, her husband, technically, though that word sat in her mouth awkwardly. No matter how many times she encountered the need to use it, would have finished his shift hours ago. He worked corporate security on the day rotation, the kind of unremarkable position that required a uniform and a badge and the willingness to be invisible. She imagined him at home now, in the small house across town, probably asleep. His daughter, Tessa, had school in the morning. He would be home by 6:30 every night without fail, because Tessa had dinner at 6:45, and Ronan Vale, whatever he was or wasn't, was the kind of father who showed up for dinner. She did not expect him to come for her. It didn't occur to her to expect it. There was no version of the picture in her head in which the quiet security guard, who said almost nothing to her in 3 years of occupying the same building, was going to walk through the walls of wherever this was. She focused instead on what she actually had. A folding chair, zip ties that were tight but not tourniqueted, concrete floor with visible drainage grates. A man checking his phone every 40-odd seconds waiting for a call that apparently hadn't come yet. The other 2, one near the entrance she'd come through, one stationed near what looked like a secondary door on the far side of the space. She was calculating angles when the secondary door stopped existing. It didn't open. That was the thing she would try to explain later, and never quite managed to communicate accurately. Doors opened. This one simply ceased to be a barrier between the outside and the inside. One moment it was there, a solid slab of industrial metal in its frame, and then there was a man on the other side of it, already moving, already inside the space, as if doors were suggestions he had considered and dismissed. He came in low and fast, and the guard nearest the secondary entrance had approximately 3/4 of a second to register that something was wrong before it was over for him. Not dead. Celeste registered that immediately the guard was on the floor but breathing, and the man who had put him there was already moving again. The second guard reacted faster. He was trained. She could see that he squared up, came forward, and managed 2 decent exchanges before the man she was watching executed. Something she didn't have the vocabulary to describe, only the capacity to observe. It was economical. No wasted movement. The kind of efficiency that didn't come from gym sessions or self-defense classes. It came from somewhere that had demanded it under conditions where not having it meant dying. The second guard went down. The man in charge square jaw, professional patience, had his weapon out. He'd had it out since the first guard hit the ground, which meant he was good, and he was already speaking. "Don't move. Hands where I can see." "Put it down," Ronan said. Celeste's brain stalled on the name for a full second. His voice was different. That was the first thing she noticed, and it was such a strange thing to notice with a gun in the room that she almost couldn't believe it was her primary observation. She had heard Ronan speak maybe a dozen times in 3 years. Brief, polite, essentially invisible words exchanged in hallways and elevator lobbies. "Good morning, yes ma'am, have a good evening." This voice was related to that one the way a photograph of a fire was related to the fire itself. It occupied the same frequency, but carried an entirely different weight. "I count 3 to 1. the square-jawed man said. Your math is bad. 2 of your people are down, Ronan said. Your principal hasn't called. You've been waiting 40 minutes. Whatever leverage you came here expecting to have, it's not coming. Put it down and we walk out of here. Or don't, and this takes longer. A beat. Who are you? Someone who's been watching this building longer than your people have, Ronan said. Put it down. The square-jawed man looked at the 2 men on the floor, and something shifted in his face, not fear, exactly, but a recalculation. He was professional enough to recognize that the equation had changed. He set the weapon on the ground slowly, stood up, and put his hands behind his head. Smart, Ronan said. Then, without turning toward her, in a tone so different from what he'd just used that it made her flinch slightly. Are you hurt? Celeste looked at him. He was wearing dark clothing, nothing tactical or theatrical, just dark jeans and a jacket. He had a small kit at his hip. There was a cut on his left forearm she couldn't account for, and his breathing was elevated but controlled. I'm not hurt, she said. Zip ties, yes. He crossed the space, crouched in front of her without ceremony, and cut the ties with a small folding knife. She felt the release of pressure in her wrists and became aware, only then, of how much they had been aching. He stood, looked at her once, directly, with an expression she had no frame of reference for, because she had never actually looked at his face long enough to catalog anything in it. We need to go, he said. I called them before I came in. They're 12 minutes out. We need to go now because I'd rather not be here when they arrive to answer questions that are going to take 6 hours. She stood. Her legs were steady, she was gratified to discover.
How did you know where I was?
She asked. He'd already moved toward the secondary door, and she followed him because there was nowhere else to follow. I'll explain in the car, he said. The car was a 10-year-old sedan that smelled like fast food wrappers and a child's strawberry shampoo. Celeste Armitage, who was driven to work every morning in a blacked-out executive SUV, sat in the passenger seat of a vehicle with a crack in the dashboard and a small purple stuffed rabbit wedged between the center console and the gear shift, and said nothing for a very long time. Ronan drove. Not fast, not recklessly, he drove the way he'd moved in the warehouse, efficiently, with an awareness of everything around them that she could feel even in the dark. He checked the mirrors at intervals that she gradually realized were not reflexive, but deliberate. He drove 2 blocks in the wrong direction before turning, then doubled back through a residential street she wouldn't have thought to take. She watched him. He had a specific face she'd never noticed. Broad through the jaw, a nose that had been broken at least once and reset imperfectly, a scar that ran along the left side of his chin that she had never been close enough to see before. He was 37 years old. He looked like a man who had been places that aged people in ways that had nothing to do with vanity. My schedule, she said finally. They knew exactly where I'd be and when. That's internal. Yes, he said. You already knew that. I had suspicions. Earlier tonight, I confirmed them. How long have you been? She stopped. Reframed. When did you put the camera footage together? He glanced at her briefly. 6 days ago. 6 days ago. I wanted more before I brought it to you. I was building a complete picture. And tonight, when the cameras went dark, I had a secondary feed they didn't know about. I watched them take you. He said it without drama. Just the fact of it, stated plainly. I was 3 blocks away when your car reached the parking level. The stuffed rabbit caught the light from a passing street lamp, and Celeste looked at it and thought about Tessa, who was 8 years old and had a father, who had apparently spent the evening tracking kidnappers across the city instead of sleeping, and who was now driving his wife who had never once asked how he was, who had treated his presence in her building as a mildly inconvenient artifact of an obligation she resented home through the rain. She didn't say any of that. You moved like you've done that before, she said. The windshield wipers cleared a sheet of rain. He didn't answer immediately. Ronan. Yes, he said. I've done it before. She turned to look at his profile in the dark, at this man she had legally married 3 years ago at her father's request, and had not meaningfully spoken to since the ceremony, and understood with a clarity that arrived late, but arrived completely, that she did not know the first thing about him. Who are you? She asked. He signaled a turn. The sedan rolled through a quiet intersection. That's a long conversation, he said, and you've had a rough night. I own a defense technology company, she said. I've had briefings that lasted 14 hours. I can handle a long conversation. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it disappeared. Tomorrow, he said. Let me get you home first. She faced forward. Out the window the city moved past, rain-soaked and indifferent, all its lights smeared and doubled in the wet streets. Somewhere in the weight of the silence between them, A shape was beginning to form something. She had been too certain and too busy to notice for 3 years, and she was not yet ready to look at it directly. But she would be. She could feel it coming, the way you feel a storm before the first drop falls. She just didn't know yet how much it was going to change. She didn't sleep. That wasn't unusual for Celeste Armitage. She averaged 5 hours on a good week, and had long since stopped apologizing for the missed calls and unanswered messages that accumulated in the small hours while she worked. But this particular sleeplessness was different in texture from her usual kind. The usual kind was productive. She would lie in the dark running contract language through her head or restructuring presentations, her brain treating the absence of distraction as an opportunity rather than a rest. This was not that. This was the kind of sleeplessness where the brain refused to land on anything useful and instead circled the same few images over and over the way water circles a drain. Ronan's hands cutting the zip ties, the economy of it. No hesitation. No drama, just the knife, the zip tie done. The way he'd told the man with the gun to put it down, not as a request or a negotiation, but as a statement of how the next few minutes were going to proceed, and the man with the gun had understood. The stuffed purple rabbit wedged against the gear shift of his 10-year-old sedan. She was in her penthouse on the 53rd floor, lying in sheets that cost more than Ronan probably made in a month, staring at a ceiling she had chosen with an interior designer 2 years ago, and could no longer tell you the reason she'd picked it. And she was thinking about a man she had met at an altar 3 years ago, and then spent the subsequent 36 months doing a very thorough job of not thinking about at all. She'd agreed to the marriage because her father had asked her to. That was the complete story, as she had always filed it. Her father, Marcus Armitage, had been dying and had known he was dying, and he'd come to her 6 weeks before the end and said there was a man he trusted more than almost anyone alive, and he needed Celeste to do something for him. The something was a legal marriage, a document, a name on paper. He hadn't explained why in terms that satisfied her, only that Ronan Vale had earned it, that the arrangement would protect certain financial provisions he wanted to put in place, and that he was asking as a dying man rather than as her father. She had said yes. She had gone to a courthouse with Ronan Vale, exchanged the minimum required words, signed her name, and returned to running the company she had just inherited. She had offered Ronan the security position because it seemed like the practical thing to do with a husband who had no apparent other arrangement, and because the company provided benefits she thought he might need, and because it kept the whole improbable situation at arm's length in a way that felt manageable. She had not asked him a single personal question in 3 years. She lay there understanding, in the particular honesty that comes at 2 a.m, that this had been a choice. Not negligence, not oversight. A deliberate, sustained choice to not look at the man standing at the edge of her life, because looking would have required her to deal with whatever she found there, and she had been too busy or too defended to want that. At 4:15, she gave up on sleep and sat at her kitchen island with a glass of water and her laptop and pulled up everything she could find publicly on Ronan Vale. There was almost nothing. That in itself was its own kind of information. She arrived at his house at 9 the next morning without calling ahead. This was, she recognized, an objectively rude thing to do to someone who had driven through a rainstorm at midnight to pull her out of a warehouse. She recognized it and did it anyway. Partly because she didn't have his number, she had never asked for it, she realized, had communicated with him for 3 years exclusively through her assistant, and partly because she needed to see the house before she spoke to him. She needed to see it cold, without preparation, without him having the chance to put things away. She wasn't sure what she expected. Something sparse, maybe. Utilitarian. A place that was less a home than a temporary arrangement, the kind of space a man maintains when he's waiting for his actual life to start or resume. She got directions wrong twice. His neighborhood was in the part of the city that didn't appear much in the publications. She read small wood-frame houses with postage stamp yards, chain-link fences, bird baths, basketball hoops, anchored in driveways with cracked concrete. The trees were old here, their roots disrupting the sidewalks in slow-motion violence, and the whole place had the particular quality of a neighborhood that had been overlooked for long enough that it had stopped caring and become comfortable in itself. She sat in her car for a moment after she parked. The house at the end of the block was white with blue shutters, one of which was slightly crooked, and the front yard was small and clean except for a bicycle lying on its side near the porch steps. One of its training wheels bent at an angle that suggested a recent collision with something. A wind chime made of mismatched metal pieces hung from the porch ceiling and was complaining softly about the morning breeze. She got out of the car. She knocked twice on the front door and heard the specific interior chaos of a child's voice, something thudding, and then the distinct sound of an adult saying, with patience that had texture to it, "Tessa, Tessa, just leave it, I'll get it." The door opened. Ronan was in a gray t-shirt and sweatpants with paint on the left knee, holding a dish towel, and he looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not surprise. Exactly. More like a man who had been half expecting something he had hoped might wait a little longer. "Ms. Armitage," he said. "Celeste," she said. It came out a little sharper than she intended. "We're married. You can call me Celeste." Something moved in his eyes. "Celeste," he said. "Come in." The inside of the house was the opposite of sparse. She understood that within about 4 seconds of stepping through the door, and the understanding landed with a specific weight that she needed a moment to absorb. The small entryway opened into a living room that was dense with evidence of human occupation. A couch with 3 different throw blankets in different states of deployment, a low wooden coffee table covered in crayon drawings and 2 empty juice boxes, and a book about horses that had been left spine up. The walls were covered in Tessa's artwork, not in the careful museum-like way of parents who want to show off their child's output, but in the exuberant, slightly disorganized way of a man who kept putting things up because his daughter kept making things and he couldn't bring himself to take any of it down. Between the drawings were photographs, family-style shots, a few of Tessa at various ages, some outdoor photographs of mountains and water, and in one corner, pushed slightly behind a framed drawing of what appeared to be a purple horse, a photograph of a group of men in desert terrain, squinting in strong sunlight, all of them in a state of deliberate unwinding that read like the end of something hard. Ronan was watching her look at it. "Coffee?" he said.
Yes.
"Thank you." She followed him into the kitchen, which was small and slightly chaotic in the way of a kitchen that got actual use. There were dishes drying in a rack, a magnetic knife strip that had one knife missing, a child's illustrated calendar on the refrigerator with appointments marked in 2 different handwriting styles. She looked at the calendar, soccer on Tuesdays, library Wednesdays, something called Dad Reading Time on Sundays, marked in purple crayon. From somewhere in the back of the house, Tessa's voice floated out, engaged in what sounded like a negotiation with a stuffed animal. Ronan poured 2 mugs of coffee without asking how she took it, then set a small pitcher of cream and a bowl of sugar on the counter between them and let her make her own choices. She noticed that. He didn't assume. Small thing, but she'd been in enough meetings with men who assumed to notice when one didn't. She took the coffee black. He did the same. "The men from last night," she said, "in police custody. The lead investigator called me at 6 this morning. They're not talking, but they will. You gave a statement? Enough of one." He looked at his mug. "I kept some things general." "What things?" He set the mug down on the counter. Looked at her in that direct way she was still adjusting to. He made eye contact like a man who had learned a long time ago that looking away cost more than it saved. "Let me ask you something first," he said. "Did you come here to say thank you, or did you come here for something else?" She didn't answer immediately, because the honest answer was the latter, and she appreciated, grudgingly, that he'd made it easy to be honest. "I couldn't find anything on you," she said. "Public records. Anything. You're essentially a ghost before about 5 years ago." "I know, that's not an accident." "No, so I came to ask who you actually are," she said, "and I'd like you to tell me." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might refuse. She was already calculating how she would push back when a small voice said, from the kitchen doorway, "Dad, Sergeant Hopscotch won't stand up." Tessa was 8 years old and wearing a shirt with a sequined cat on it, and she had her father's dark eyes and a gap where one of her front teeth used to be. She was holding a stuffed rabbit, not purple. She noted green that appeared to have a leg going in a direction it wasn't designed to go. "Bring him here," Ronan said. Tessa came forward and deposited the rabbit in Ronan's hands, then looked at Celeste with the frank curiosity that 8-year-olds apply to strangers before social conditioning teaches them to pretend they're not staring. "You were at the building," Tessa said. "I saw your picture. Dad has your picture." Celeste looked at Ronan. "On the company website," he said, without inflection. "She's the CEO," Tessa explained to the rabbit, in a tone that suggested the rabbit needed the context. Then to Celeste, "Dad fixed Sergeant Hopscotch's leg 4 times. He always fixes things." "I can see that," Celeste said. Ronan was already examining the rabbit's leg with the same focused attention she'd watched him apply to a man with a gun 12 hours ago. The contrast was so specific and so complete that she had to look away for a moment. He found what he was looking for, made an adjustment, tested it, and handed Sergeant Hopscotch back to Tessa upright and stable. "Okay," he said. "Okay," Tessa confirmed and disappeared. Ronan picked up his coffee. "She's a good kid," Celeste said. "She's the best person I know," he said, simply, and she believed him entirely. They moved to the small back porch after that, which looked out over a yard that had a wooden swing set with a broken slide and a vegetable garden in the corner that was slightly overgrown with late-season things. Ronan sat on the porch steps, and she took the wooden chair that had a cushion tied to it, with a knot that had been retied several times. He told her in the same way he seemed to do most things directly, without embellishment, in a voice that was level but not flat. There were places where the level quality cost him something, and she could see the cost in the way certain sentences came out slightly shorter than the rest, as though he'd edited them mid-delivery. He'd joined the Navy at 19, made it to SEALs by 22, which, he said, he'd been told was on the faster end, though he said it without pride, more as a data point. He'd served for 13 years. Most of it he described in the vague architecture of classified work locations, types of operations, general shape of things without specifics. She didn't press. She understood enough about the defense bench world to read the outlines. What he told her specifically was the last operation. It had been a hostage extraction in a situation where the intelligence was solid, supposedly. 14 people in a building. A small team, a narrow window, parameters that had been tested and approved. What the intelligence had failed to account for was a secondary structure, a basement room, and 4 civilians who were not supposed to be there. Ronan had been on point. That meant he was first in. He said 4 civilians in the same level void, and then stopped speaking for a moment, looking at the vegetable garden, and she counted the pause without marking it because she understood it was not a pause for effect. 3 of the 4 civilians had survived. The 4th was a child. A boy, he said. He thought the boy was about 7. The official inquiry had cleared everyone on the team. The intelligence failure was institutional. Nobody on the ground had done anything outside their parameters. These were the facts, and she had enough context to understand that they were probably true. None of that was the point, he said. He'd known that in the hours after it happened, and he'd continued knowing it for every year since. The inquiry's findings didn't change anything about what he'd seen, and they didn't change anything about the fact that he'd been first in. He'd finished out his contract, then he'd come home, and he'd stayed home. Tessa had been 3. Her mother had been gone since Tessa was 14 months old. He said this without elaboration, and she didn't ask. And coming home to a 3-year-old, who called him Dada and fell asleep on his chest had been, he said, the only thing that made the transition to civilian life, something he could navigate, without going completely to pieces. And my father, Celeste said. Ronan looked at her. "Tell me how my father fits into this," she said, the real version. He reached into the pocket of his sweatpants. She noticed he'd been holding his phone loosely in one hand through most of the conversation, and set it face down on the step beside him. "How much do you know about the summer you were 7?" he said. She didn't understand the question immediately. "What? Do you remember an accident? A fall. At the country house." The memories surfaced with the specific haziness of very early childhood, the big stone patio, the retaining wall at the back of the property, the way the drop on the other side was much further than her 7-year-old brain had properly registered. "I fell. I hit my head. I was in the hospital for I don't remember how long." 8 days, Ronan said. "You were unconscious for 3 of them." She looked at him. "I was 14, he said. "I worked that summer for a landscaping company. We did the properties in that area, big houses, weekend work. I was near the retaining wall when you went over." The porch was very quiet. Inside the house, Tessa was singing something to Sergeant Hopscotch, an improvised melody with words that didn't quite scan. "You pulled me out," Celeste said. "I got down to you before you rolled further. The drop below the first level was about 30 feet. You'd have gone over it if—" He stopped. "You were unconscious. I held you until the adults came." She tried to find the memory and couldn't. She'd been 7, and then she'd been in the hospital, and the gap between those 2 points had always just been a gap. She'd known there was a fall. She'd never known about the boy. "My father knew," she said. "He came to the hospital. He came to find out who I was." Ronan paused. He was the kind of man who needed to know who had done something like that, and then needed to do something about it. "He paid for my college. I told him it wasn't necessary, and he said it wasn't about what was necessary. It was about what was right. He never told me," she said. "He said you were too young at first, And then by the time you were old enough, too much time had passed. He said he didn't want you to feel like you owed something to a stranger you didn't remember. She thought about her father, brilliant, complicated Marcus Armitage, who had cried only once in her memory and had apologies she'd never heard. The apologies she'd never heard and debts he'd tracked with the precision of a man who understood that some things couldn't go unpaid. And then he was dying, she said. He reached out to me about 2 years before the end. We'd stayed in occasional contact. He knew I'd been in the SEALs, knew I'd left. He knew Tessa. He asked me to let him know if I ever needed anything. Ronan picked up his coffee from the step. When he got sick, he called and said he was making arrangements. He said you were going to run the company and he was worried. Not about whether you could do it. He never doubted that. He worried about what it would cost you. He didn't need to worry about that, she said, and heard how it came out and said, more quietly, he could have just told me. He knew how you'd respond, Ronan said. She looked at him. He said it without judgment, just as a fact. She thought about how she'd have responded at 27, inheriting a billion-dollar defense company and a grief she hadn't known how to hold if her dying father had said, "There's a man I trust, and I want you to marry him." She thought about how she'd have dug in and refused, and how she'd have been convinced she was protecting herself. He knew I'd push back, she said. He said he was going to ask you anyway.
That you'd say yes.
Because he was dying. Because you loved him, Ronan said. And he knew that. She was quiet for a moment. The vegetable garden sat in its cheerful, slightly untidy state in the corner of the yard. A cat she hadn't noticed before was sitting on top of the fence on the far side, watching them with the particular indifference of something that had better things to do. You've known all of this, she said. This whole time. Everything you just told me. And you showed up every morning to an office where She stopped herself. Where you what? Where I treated you like you weren't there, she said. It was harder to say than she expected. He didn't agree and he didn't argue. He just said, I understood why. I don't think that makes it acceptable. It makes it understandable, he said. Those aren't the same thing, but one of them was enough for me to work with. She looked at him for a long moment at the broken nose and the repaired scar and the gray t-shirt with paint on the knee and the man who had saved her twice, once when she was 7 and once last night, and who had shown up every morning to a building where she had walked past him without seeing him, and who had spent the interval raising a daughter who called a stuffed rabbit Sergeant Hopscotch and believed her father could fix anything. The photograph, she said. The one in the living room. The men in the desert. My team, he said. Are they? Some of them, he said. Some of them aren't. She didn't ask which were which. The people who took me, she said. You said it's internal. Someone at Vanguard. It has to be. The schedule data, the camera feeds, the access level needed to compromise both of those belongs to a very short list of people. You have a list. I have the beginning of one. She absorbed this. The CEO part of her brain, which had been waiting with characteristic impatience for the conversation to arrive at something actionable, came forward. I want to see everything you have. I'll put it together properly first. It needs to be done right, or it gives whoever it is a way to discredit it.
How long?
Few days. He looked at her steadily. You need to keep acting normally in the meantime. Don't change your schedule. Don't let whoever it is know you're looking. Can you do that? I've been running a defense company under congressional scrutiny for 3 years, she said. I can hold my face together. I know you can. Something in the simple delivery of it, not flattery, just acknowledgement, caught her sideways. She looked out at the yard. I want you on my personal detail, she said. Starting Monday. Formally. Whatever your current assignment is, I'll have it reassigned. He was quiet. Ronan, you don't have to do that, he said. I know I don't have to. She turned back to him. I want to. And I want you to have actual access to my security infrastructure, not whatever level your current position gave you. She paused. How did you get a secondary camera feed, by the way? You didn't have authorization for that. No, he agreed. You did it anyway, yes. She should have had a problem with that. The legal and liability architecture of the company required her to have a problem with that. She found sitting on a porch in the part of the city she'd never been to, drinking coffee made in a kitchen with a child's calendar on the fridge, that she did not remotely have a problem with that. Monday, she said. Monday, he said. From inside the house came Tessa's voice at elevated volume. Dad. Dad, I spilled the juice. Ronan stood in a single motion, set his mug on the step and opened the back door. Then he paused half inside and looked back at her. You can stay, he said. If you want. I'm making lunch in an hour. It's nothing complicated. She looked at the offer, which was something she wasn't used to receiving, and wasn't sure she knew how to accept gracefully. "What are you making?" she said. "Grilled cheese and tomato soup. It's what Tessa wants." She had eaten in restaurants that carried 3 Michelin stars. She had had meals prepared by private chefs at events where the guest list included sitting senators. She looked at this man she'd married and barely known, standing in the doorway of a house that was full of crayon drawings and stuffed animals with military ranks, and said, "That sounds fine." His expression shifted into something that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lived in the same neighborhood as one. Then he went inside to deal with the juice situation, and she sat on the porch with her coffee, and the cat on the fence regarded her with lowered expectations, and the wind chime at the front of the house sent its mismatched metal notes around the corner of the building like they had somewhere to be. She sat with the information he'd given her and sorted through it the way she sorted through everything methodically, with the part of her brain that assigned things to categories. Except the categories kept breaking down, because the information didn't fit the framework she'd been using. She'd built a picture of Ronan Vale over 3 years by not looking at him, and the picture had been what you got when you didn't look. Absence, blankness, the outline of a person with nothing filled in. The actual man was not blank. The actual man had 13 years of service, and a last operation that had gone wrong in a way he'd never stopped carrying, and a daughter who was the axis his life turned around, and a debt to her father that he'd paid without ever once asking Celeste to acknowledge it. He had shown up in that warehouse last night, not because his job required it. His job was corporate security, 8 to 5, nothing more, but because he had decided, at some point in the previous 3 years, that the arrangement he'd entered into on her father's behalf carried responsibilities he was going to honor, regardless of whether she ever noticed. She thought about her father. Marcus Armitage had understood people the way some people understood weather, not by analysis, but by feel, by long familiarity, by something in the blood. He had seen a 14-year-old boy climb down a retaining wall to hold an unconscious 7-year-old girl, and he had recognized something. Not just the act, but the person capable of the act. He had tracked that person for 23 years, quietly, at a distance, waiting for the moment when the debt could be paid in both directions. He had given her a husband. What he had actually been giving her, she was beginning to understand, was something she wouldn't have accepted if he'd described it correctly. He'd been giving her a person she could trust. The screen door opened and Tessa came out onto the porch. She sat down on the top step where Ronan had been and looked at Celeste with that direct, uncomplicated scrutiny that children hadn't yet learned to disguise. "Are you staying for lunch?" Tessa asked. "Your dad invited me," Celeste said. "Is that okay with you?" Tessa considered this with apparent seriousness. "Do you like tomato soup?" "I haven't had it in a while." "Dad makes it from actual tomatoes, not the canned kind. He says the canned kind tastes like sadness." Tessa paused. "I think the canned kind is fine, but I don't tell him that." Celeste looked at this child with her sequined cat shirt and her gap-toothed honesty and felt something shift inside her chest. Not dramatically. It wasn't a revelatory moment with swelling internal music. It was smaller than that. It was a crack in something she had kept very carefully sealed, and what came through it was something she hadn't budgeted for. "That seems like a kind thing to do," Celeste said. "Dad tries hard," Tessa said. "He tries hard at everything." She picked at a loose piece of wood on the porch railing. "He was sad for a long time. He's not as sad now. But sometimes at night he gets up and sits in the kitchen." Celeste was quiet. "I get up too," Tessa said, "but I don't let him see me. I just check that he's there and then go back to bed." The morning light came through the gap between the houses and lit up the section of the yard where the vegetable garden was, warming the overgrown tomato plants, and the thing she thought might be basil, and the general cheerful disorder of things planted with intention and then allowed to express themselves. "You're a good person to have in someone's corner," Celeste said. Tessa shrugged. "The way kids do when they don't know what to do with a compliment." "He's my dad," she said, as if this were the complete and sufficient explanation. As if having a dad worth showing up for in the middle of the night was nothing more than the natural state of things. Celeste thought maybe Tessa was right. She thought maybe that was exactly what it was supposed to be. Inside, she could hear Ronan moving around the kitchen, and the small sounds of preparation: a pan, running water, the particular thud of a cutting board being set down, and above it all, the muffled sound of Sergeant Hopscotch being addressed about matters of importance by his 8-year-old commanding officer. She finished her coffee. She had come here this morning looking for information. She had found that, and she had found more than that, and the more than that was going to require some time to settle into its proper place. But she was 30 years old, and she ran a company that built systems designed to see threats before they arrived, and she was not, when the moment came, someone who looked away from what she'd found. She had spent 3 years not looking at Ronan Vale. She wasn't going to make that particular mistake again. The promotion went through on Monday morning without fanfare, which was how Celeste had handled it, a quiet reassignment process through HR before most of the executive floor arrived. A new access credential issued to Ronan Vale, effective 8 a.m., and a brief internal notice that described his new role as Senior Director of Executive Security in the kind of bland institutional language designed to be read and immediately forgotten. What it did not say was that the new Senior Director of Executive Security had spent the previous 13 years conducting operations that the relevant government agencies preferred not to discuss in unclassified settings. It did not say that he had spent the past week quietly building a surveillance infrastructure inside Armitage Vanguard's own security network that was invisible to everyone except himself. And it did not say that the CEO who had just elevated him was the same woman who 8 days ago had walked past him in the lobby without acknowledgement every single morning, and had now eaten grilled cheese in his kitchen and helped his daughter with a homework assignment about the water cycle. That last part still caught Ronan slightly sideways when he thought about it. He had been careful, over 3 years, not to think about Celeste Armitage in any register other than professional. Not because it was difficult, it wasn't, but because it was necessary. The arrangement her father had constructed was built on a specific foundation. Marcus had given him a purpose and a structure, and a reason to stay tethered to something larger than Tessa's school schedule and his own deteriorating relationship with sleep. In return, Ronan had agreed to be what Marcus needed him to be: nearby, watchful, available. He had not agreed to want anything from it, and he had been careful not to. The morning in the kitchen, watching Celeste try to explain the water cycle to Tessa, using a cereal bowl, a cup of water, and a piece of plastic wrap patient in a way that seemed to cost her something, as though patience was a muscle she didn't use often, and could feel the unfamiliar burn of had made that carefulness considerably harder to maintain. He pushed the thought aside. There was a more immediate problem. The evidence he'd assembled over the previous week was now organized across 3 encrypted drives and a secondary system he'd built on hardware he'd purchased personally and kept off Vanguard's network entirely. He'd done this instinctively, the same way he'd done everything in his previous life: assume the environment is compromised until proven otherwise, operate from the outside edge, and never put anything you need into infrastructure you don't fully control. Sitting at the desk in his new office, a real office, glass-walled, with a view of the executive floor's central atrium, he pulled up the access logs for the night of the kidnapping and started again from the beginning. Celeste's schedule that evening had been modified twice in the 24 hours preceding the abduction. Both modifications had been entered through the executive scheduling system by someone using valid credentials. The first modification, moving her departure time from 11 p.m. to 12:15 a.m., had been made at 3:47 in the afternoon, using an access token that logged to her assistant's account. Her assistant was 24 years old, had been with Vanguard for 11 months, and had spent the 2 weeks prior to the kidnapping on an approved leave of absence due to a family illness. Her credentials had been active during that leave. That was either a significant oversight or something deliberate, and in Ronan's experience, things that looked like oversights rarely were. The camera shutdown was more surgical. 11 cameras, all in the parking level and the surrounding exterior zones, had been taken offline in a sequence that lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The shutdown commands had come through the security network's administrative layer, which required a level of access that belonged to 7 people in the entire company. Ronan had the list. 2 of the 7 were him and Celeste. 3 others were in the security department, 2 men he'd worked alongside for 2 years, and 1 who'd been there since the company's founding. The remaining 2 were on the executive operations side, a VP of infrastructure named Douglas Hale, and the company's chief technology officer, a woman named Priya Sandhu, who had been with Armitage Vanguard for 9 years and sat 3 chairs to Celeste's left at every board meeting. He'd been looking at all of them. He was now looking most carefully at 2. The first was Douglas Hale. Hale was 51, had worked in defense infrastructure management for 20 years, and had a financial situation that required a closer look. 3 months ago, he had paid off a mortgage that should have had 8 years remaining on it. The payment had come from an account that predated his time at Vanguard. The account had received 2 wire transfers in the preceding year from a holding company registered in Delaware that, when Ronan traced it through 6 layers of corporate structure, eventually resolved to a parent entity with documented financial relationships to Hargrove Defense Systems, Vanguard's primary competitor, on the Pentagon contract currently under review. The second was something Ronan had not expected and was still sitting with. Among the 7 administrators with camera access, one of them had queried the system twice in the week before the kidnapping, pulling the specific camera coverage maps for the underground parking level. Those queries had been logged and then deleted, but deleted logs left residue in the backup architecture if you knew where to look, and Ronan had spent enough time in environments where people deleted things for catastrophic reasons to know exactly where to look. The queries had come from the account of Raymond Goss. Raymond Goss had been Armitage Vanguard's head of internal security since Marcus Armitage had founded the company. He was 63 years old, had served under Marcus for 18 years, and had personally attended Marcus's funeral and cried in a way that Ronan, who had also attended, quietly from the back had registered as genuine. That was the part that troubled Ronan most, because he had extensive experience with people who did terrible things and also loved the people they betrayed, and he understood that the two were not mutually exclusive. People got into things for reasons that made sense at the time and then couldn't get out, and the love was real even as the betrayal accelerated, and the tragedy was that neither fact canceled the other. He hadn't brought any of this to Celeste yet. He needed one more thing confirmed. She knocked on his office door at 2:15, which was already different from anything that had existed in their dynamic before, in the previous arrangement. She would never have knocked on his door, because she would never have come to his part of the building. Now she knocked the way she did everything, directly twice, and was opening the door before he'd finished saying, "Come in." She was in what he'd come to understand was her working armor, a charcoal blazer, dark trousers, hair pulled back, the kind of appearance that said, "I have been making decisions since 6 a.m. and I will continue making them until you stop presenting me with problems." She sat down across from him without ceremony and looked at the screens. "You found something," she said. "I found several things." He turned the primary screen toward her. "Walk me through what you know about Douglas Hale." She looked at the screen. Her expression didn't change, but something around her eyes tightened in the way he'd started to recognize as the tell she didn't know. She had the specific tightening that happened when information landed somewhere it didn't fit. "Doug Hale has been with us for 6 years, she said. "Infrastructure VP. He's been on every major systems overhaul since I took over." She stopped. "What am I looking at?" "His mortgage was paid in full 14 weeks ago. The source is a holding company that traces to Hargrove Defense." The name landed the way he expected it to. She sat back slightly, and he could almost see the architecture of her thinking reorganize around the new information. "You're sure," she said. "About the financial trail, yes. About his direct involvement, I'm still building it. But the access pattern on the camera shutdown is consistent with someone who understood the system intimately. Hale oversaw the last security infrastructure upgrade. He'd know every node." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the screen. "And this is not the part that's bothering you," she said. He'd been prepared to ease into the second name. Looking at her, at the careful attention she brought to everything, the way she was already 3 steps ahead in her processing, he decided she didn't need easing into anything. "Raymond Goss," he said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. "No," she said. Not a denial, it was too controlled for a denial. It was the sound of a mind pushing hard against an idea it didn't want to accommodate. The camera queries were made from his account. They were deleted but minus. Anyone with his access level could have used his account. Yes, they could have. He let her have that for a moment. But the queries were made at 6:47 in the morning, 2 weeks before the kidnapping. That's before most of the executive floor arrives. His card key logged him into the building at 6:31 that day. He was the only administrator in the building. She stood up, walked to the glass wall that looked out over the atrium. She stood there with her back to him, her arms crossed, and he gave her a minute because she needed it, and because he'd already had his minute with this information and knew what it cost. Raymond Goss had worked for Marcus Armitage for 18 years. He had been, as far as Ronan had been able to tell from everything Marcus had told him in those last months, one of the people Marcus had genuinely trusted. He had sat at the funeral and cried. "He knew my father," she said. Her voice was level, but not in the practiced way in the way of someone keeping it level through active effort. I know, he was at the hospital when my father was dying. He came to see him 3 times in the last 2 weeks. I know, she turned around. Her face was composed, but her eyes had something in them he'd seen before, in people who were metabolizing a specific kind of hurt, not surprise, because some part of her had probably been a step ahead of herself and already sensed something wasn't right, but the grief of confirmation. "What do you need to nail it down?" she said. "I need to access the server backups from the month before the kidnapping. The secondary archive, not the primary. The primary will have been cleaned. Your father set up a redundant archive system when the company was founded. It runs on a separate physical server in the sub-basement. Goss doesn't know it exists." "I know about it," she said. "My father showed me. It was his backup plan." She stopped. "He never said backup for what?" "Backup for the possibility that someone inside might one day try to cover their tracks," Ronan said. She looked at him for a long moment. "My father thought about this," she said. "He thought this was a possibility. He thought many possibilities through," Ronan said carefully. "He was a careful man." She absorbed that. "When do you need to access the server?" "Tonight. After hours. I need you to come with me because it requires a 2-person biometric authorization." "Tonight," she said. "There's a board dinner at the Whitmore starting at 7. Everyone on the list will be accounted for. If we go in at 7:30, we have a 2-hour window." She nodded. The grief was still in her eyes, but something else had come forward around it, the specific hardening that happened when she made a decision and moved into it. He'd watched it happen in the board meetings he'd stood at the back of for 3 years, and he could see it now up close, which was different. "Tonight," she said again, and it wasn't a question this time. The weeks that had preceded this moment would have looked unremarkable to anyone observing from outside, which was partly the point. In the official ledger of visible activity, Celeste had promoted a low-level security employee and returned to her regular schedule. She attended meetings. She signed off on contract language. She appeared at 2 industry events and gave a brief statement to a defense publication about Vanguard's readiness timeline. Her schedule ran on its usual tracks, and her public performance was immaculate because she had been performing composure under pressure since she was 23 years old and had walked into her first board meeting knowing that half the men in the room thought she was a placeholder while they found someone more suitable. But the private weeks were different. She had begun going to Ronan's house in the evenings. Not every evening, 3 or 4 times a week in the early days, with an awkwardness on all sides that she appreciated for its honesty. She would arrive around 6, which was when Tessa was usually finishing homework, and the routine that developed had the slightly improvised quality of 3 people figuring out a new arrangement in real time, making small mistakes, correcting them, trying again. The first time she attempted to help Tessa with a math worksheet, she explained fractions in terms of stock division ratios, which did not land. Ronan had come in from the kitchen, looked at the worksheet, and said without inflection, which made it worse, and also somehow better, maybe start smaller. She had taken the pencil back and started smaller, and Tessa had gotten it on the second try, and the expression on the girl's face when the numbers worked out had been something Celeste hadn't expected to feel anything about, and had felt something about regardless. Ronan cooked most nights. Not elaborately, he cooked the way he did other things, efficiently and with full attention, without performing it. Pasta, soup, chicken, with whatever was in the refrigerator's honest state at the time of assembly. He cooked enough for 3 without making a ceremony of it, and she ate at a kitchen table with a sticky patch in one corner that nobody had gotten around to addressing, and the food was ordinary in the best way, meaning it was made by someone for people he wanted to feed. She noticed the things that Tessa had described, the way Ronan moved through evenings with the slightly effortless ease of a man who had constructed a life he intended to be good at, and mostly was, but who carried something underneath it that didn't go away when the lights were on. He was careful with Tessa. Not careful like walking on eggshells, but careful the way someone is careful with a thing that matters more than anything, with total attention, real listening, the willingness to stop whatever else he was doing and be fully present in the conversation his daughter was having, however small. He was not like that with himself. She saw it in the moments between the way he went still, sometimes when it got quiet, the specific quality of the stillness, suggesting the quiet wasn't empty inside his head. She saw it in the way he slept, or didn't sleep. One evening she had arrived at 6:30 to find Tessa watching television and Ronan asleep on the couch with his shoes still on, his face doing things in sleep that it never did awake, not peaceful, but fought through, Like whatever his dreams contained had to be gotten past rather than rested in. She had stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment, and Tessa had come up beside her and said, in a low voice, "He didn't sleep last night." "Does that happen a lot?" Celeste asked. "Enough," Tessa said, with the compressed accuracy of a child who had learned to be precise about this. She had not woken him. They'd been eating dinner by the time he came to, disoriented for a half-second before the mask of composure settled back into place, and he'd apologized and she'd said, "Don't." And Tessa had explained that they'd saved him the bread because she knew he liked the bread. And the look on his face when his 8-year-old said that the look of a man who kept being undone by small specific kindnesses was one Celeste put in the part of her memory that she was keeping. The archive server was in the sub-basement of the secondary building, reached through a maintenance corridor that smelled of concrete dust and electrical insulation. Ronan had a pen light. Celeste had her biometric card. They went through 3 security checkpoints, each requiring both of them, and found the server room at the end of a hallway that felt deliberately inconvenient. "My father really didn't want anyone finding this casually," she said. "That was the point," Ronan said, scanning the room. The server was old, relative to the rest of Vanguard's infrastructure, a physical unit built before cloud architecture became standard, running on its own closed system. No network connection, no remote access. You had to be physically present. He connected his portable drive and started the extraction process. "How long?" she said. 20 minutes for the relevant files." She leaned against the wall across from him and watched the progress bar inch forward on his screen. The room was cold. Servers liked cold and quiet, except for the mechanical sound of the drive working. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes. When you have the nightmares." She said it directly, because circling it would have been its own kind of condescension. "What are they?" He didn't look up from the screen. "Usually the operation," he said. "The basement." "The boy." "Usually the boy, yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever, is it just the operational details? Or is it something else?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "It's usually the part after," he said. "There's a part where in the real version after, I went outside. I sat down against the exterior wall, and someone gave me water, and I drank it, and I didn't say anything for about 20 minutes. And in the dream, that part is different. In the dream, I don't sit down. I stay inside." He paused. "I don't know what I think staying inside would have changed. Nothing. It doesn't make any operational sense. But that's where it goes." She understood this not from the same experience, but from the architecture of it. The mind's insistence on a fixed point, a moment that it circles, because somewhere in the processing it got labeled as the hinge, the place where things could have been different, even when the evidence was that they couldn't. "You've been carrying that for a long time," she said. "It gets quieter," he said. "It was worse the first 2 years. Tessa helped. Tessa was the only reason I got up some mornings. And then she was the reason I wanted to actually get up. Those two things feel similar from the outside, but from the inside, they're completely different." She thought about that, the difference between being pulled through by obligation and being drawn forward by wanting to be present. She understood the first one very well. She was still learning the second. "Your father helped too," he said, "knowing someone needed me to be functional for a purpose beyond survival, that he'd trusted me enough to ask." He glanced up. "I don't say that lightly. I know how it sounds being grateful to a dying man's request." "It doesn't sound anything," she said. "It sounds like the truth." The extraction bar hit 40%. "Raymond Gosh," she said. "What about him? If it's him, I need to know why. Not for legal purposes. I know that's not how it works. I just need to know." She paused. "My father trusted him." "My father was not someone who trusted easily. People get in over their heads," Ronan said. "Sometimes slowly over time in ways they don't fully recognize until it's too late to walk it back. And sometimes fear does things to loyalty that nothing else can." "You think he was afraid?" "I think he's 63 years old, and he watched your father die, and then watched the company go to a 30-year-old woman, and someone came to him with something he was afraid of and an offer that seemed like a solution, and he made a choice that wasn't reversible." He looked at the screen. "I'm speculating, but that's the shape of it. It almost makes it worse," she said. "Yes," he said, "it does." The bar hit 70%. She uncrossed her arms and looked at the ceiling for a moment, at the exposed pipes and the bare bulbs and the infrastructure of the building, showing itself honestly down here where nobody was meant to see it. "I want to handle this correctly," she said. "I know. Not because I'm worried about optics. Because if there are people whose lives get ruined by an investigation that's sloppy or motivated by anger, That's on me. I'm the one who signs off on how this goes. You handle it the right way, Ronan said, by not handling it yourself. You get it to the right people with the right authority, and you give them everything, and you let the process run. And if the process doesn't run cleanly, then you make noise. Loudly in public, with documentation, he looked at her. You're the CEO of a major defense contractor. You have standing and resources and a platform. That's what you use. She held his gaze. You've thought about this. I've thought about what I'd do if the people I was supposed to trust with it couldn't be trusted, he said. Old habit, from when you had to plan for every contingency, from when not planning was what got people killed. The bar hit 93%. They stood in the cold server room, in the quiet of the sub-basement, with the mechanical sound of the drive doing its works. And Celeste thought about her father putting this server here, in this deliberately inconvenient place, against the possibility of a day he never told her was coming. She thought about the kind of love that expressed itself in preparation, rather than conversation that built structures for someone's protection, without telling them the structures existed, because the truth of why they were needed would have been too hard to give. She had been angry with him for years in the private way for not telling her about Ronan, for the marriage that came out of nowhere and landed in her life like an obligation with a face she didn't recognize. She had carried that anger quietly, alongside the grief, and they had kept each other company in the empty penthouse on the 53rd floor. She thought she might be ready to put the anger down. Not forgive, that wasn't the right word. Forgiveness implied he'd done something wrong, and she wasn't sure anymore that he had. Understand. She was ready, maybe, to understand. The bar hit 100%. Ronan disconnected the drive, pocketed it, and swept the room visually to confirm they'd left nothing. We have what we need, she said. Enough to take to the FBI field office, he said. I have a contact there, someone I worked alongside, years ago. He's straight. You trust him. He's one of about 6 people I trust categorically, Ronan said. So yes. They moved back through the maintenance corridor, their footsteps quiet on the concrete. Near the first checkpoint, she said, without looking at him, I'm sorry I didn't know about any of this. About you. For 3 years. You don't have to... I'm not apologizing for obligation, she said. I'm apologizing because I had access to the truth, and I chose not to look for it. That's different. He was quiet while he processed that. Okay, he said. I accept that. That's it, she said. No, you had your reasons. Or it's understandable, or some version of letting me off the hook. No, he said. You apologized. I accepted it. That's how it works. She almost smiled. It wasn't something she did easily, and it didn't fully form, but it was close enough that she felt the shape of it. You're a difficult person to manage, she said. You manage a billion-dollar company, he said. I think you can handle it. They came up out of the sub-basement into the cool air of the secondary building's ground floor, and the city outside the windows was doing what cities did at 9:30 on a weeknight, burning its lights with the cheerful indifference of something that had no particular opinion about the people moving through it. Ronan checked his phone. She checked hers. The board dinner at the Whitmore would be winding down. Douglas Hale and Raymond Goss and everyone else on the executive floor would be making their way back to their cars or their hotel rooms, or wherever people went when they'd spent an evening performing loyalty to a company. They had decided to treat as a resource to be mined. She had 3 texts from her assistant, 2 from legal, and 1 from the board chair that could wait until morning. She put her phone in her pocket. Tomorrow you call your contact, she said. First thing, he said, and until it's resolved, I need to know where you are. He looked at her. Not because I don't think you can take care of yourself, she said. Because I want to know. There's a difference. It was the most directly personal thing she'd said to him, stated in the flattest tone she owned, and she watched it land. You'll know where I am, he said. She nodded once, and they walked out of the building together through the service exit, and the city received them without ceremony, as it did everyone, and the night continued on its track around them, while 2 people who had been strangers by arrangement and something more by choice walked toward whatever was going to happen next, neither of them pretending they knew what it was, both of them willing to find out. Inside the sub-basement they'd left behind, the archive server hummed in the dark, holding the information that Marcus Armitage had stored there, years ago against a day he hoped would never come. He'd been right that it might. He'd been right that Celeste would be able to handle it when it did. He'd been right about more things than she'd given him credit for, and she was still in the process of counting them all. Ronan's contact at the FBI field office was a man named Declan Marsh, who had the specific physical quality of someone who had spent decades being underestimated and had long since decided this was an advantage rather than a problem. He was 54, medium height, with the kind of unremarkable face that blended into waiting rooms and airport terminals and congressional hallways without leaving an impression. Ronan had worked alongside him on 2 joint operations during his last year in the SEALs, and what he knew about Declan Marsh was this: the man did not move until he was certain, and when he moved, he did not stop. They met at a coffee shop 6 blocks from the federal building at 7 in the morning, because Marsh had told Ronan once that the best conversations happened before the day had fully formed its opinions. Ronan brought the drive. Marsh brought a legal pad and a pen that he didn't uncap for the first 15 minutes, during which he listened to everything Ronan laid out without interrupting once. When Ronan finished, Marsh looked at the drive on the table between them. "You built this yourself," he said. "The secondary feed, the log recovery."
Yes.
"On personal hardware off their network."
Yes.
"And the woman who runs the company?" "She's aware," Ronan said. "She wants this handled through legitimate channels." "Completely." Marsh picked up his pen. "What does she want in terms of how her company's represented in this?" "She wants accuracy," Ronan said. "She's not asking for protection. She's asking for thoroughness." Marsh looked at him. They had the specific shorthand of 2 people who had done difficult work together and trusted each other's read on situations. The financial trail to Hargrove is solid, 6 layers of corporate structure, but it resolves. I can walk you through all of it. And Goss. Ronan said nothing for a moment. "That one bothers you," Marsh said. "He's 63 years old," Ronan said. "He worked for her father for 18 years. I think he got pressured into something and then couldn't extract himself. That doesn't change what he did, but it changes the texture of it." "Noted," Marsh said. He uncapped the pen. "All right, give me everything." They were there for 2 hours. When Ronan left, Marsh was still writing. The investigation moved the way legitimate investigations moved, not quickly, and not in the clean dramatic arc that movies preferred, but methodically, building layer by layer, with the particular unglamorous patience of institutional process, doing what it was designed to do. There were warrants to apply for, and financial records to subpoena, and interviews to conduct with the careful attention that ensured nothing that mattered got thrown out on procedural grounds. Ronan had expected this. He had explained to Celeste, over her kitchen island, on the evening of the day he met Marsh, watching her process the timeline with the characteristic forward lean of someone whose default speed was considerably faster than this. "Weeks," she said, "minimum. Maybe longer. And in the meantime, Hale and Goss walk around the building." "Yes." She looked at her coffee. "I know it's uncomfortable," he said. "It's not uncomfortable," she said. "I can manage uncomfortable. It's that every time I see Raymond in the hallway, I'm going to know what I know, and he's going to think I don't know it, and I'm going to have to be normal." She paused. "My father trusted him." "I know. I keep coming back to that." She set the mug down. "Not because it changes anything. Because it tells me something about how wrong I can be about people without knowing I'm wrong." He looked at her. "That's different from what most people take from a betrayal. Most people get angry," she said. I don't know what the word is. Methodical. I start reviewing where I missed it." "You didn't miss it," he said. "Goss worked at keeping himself credible for 18 years. You were 7 when he started. You inherited him. That's not your oversight. That's a deception that predates your tenure. He might have been genuinely loyal to my father," she said. "That's the thing. He might have served my father well for 15 of those 18 years and only compromised the last 3. People aren't consistent over long timelines." "No," Ronan said. "They're not." She looked at him with the directness that he'd come to understand was not aggression, but simply how she was built. She looked at things head-on because looking sideways felt dishonest to her. "Are you consistent?" she said. "Over long timelines?" He considered. "I've changed significantly. Whether the core is consistent, I think so. But I'd be the last person to know for certain." "What's the core?" He thought about it honestly, because she'd asked honestly, and she'd know if he answered with something constructed. "I keep my commitments," he said. "I try not to make them if I can't keep them. And when things go wrong, I don't walk away from them." She was quiet for a moment. "My father saw that," she said. "At 14. He saw a teenage boy hold an unconscious 7-year-old on the side of a retaining wall and wait for adults to come, and he saw that, and he kept it. He was a precise observer," Ronan said. "He was," she said. And then quietly, "I want to be too." The weeks that followed had the compressed, layered quality of time that is simultaneously too slow and too fast slow because the investigation moved at its institutional pace, and there was nothing to do about that. Fast because the other parts of the days were filling with things that had not existed before. Celeste restructured her schedule to include actual hours at which she stopped. This had seemed in theory like a reasonable adjustment, and in practice like trying to teach a language she had no previous exposure to. The first week she left the office at 7 p.m. and spent 40 minutes sitting in her car in the parking garage before driving to Ronan's because she didn't know what to do with an evening that wasn't organized around work. The second week was better. The third week she stopped noticing that she was doing it. Tessa was an anchor in this, in ways that weren't obvious and couldn't have been predicted. The girl had the specific quality of children who had learned early to read adults. While she did not push, did not perform, did not try to make Celeste comfortable in a way that would have been exhausting. She simply went about her business and included Celeste in it when it was natural to do so. She wanted help painting the shed in the backyard not professionally, she specified, just with regular colors. And did Celeste think dark green was a good color for a shed because she thought it looked more like it was supposed to be outside? Celeste had said dark green was an excellent color for a shed, and she had spent a Saturday afternoon in old clothes she hadn't owned until that week applying dark green paint to the exterior of a small wooden shed in the backyard of a house in the part of the city she'd never been to, while Tessa provided commentary and Ronan repaired the broken slide on the swing set nearby, occasionally handing tools up to Tessa when she decided the slide repair was more interesting than the shed painting. It was the least professional Saturday Celeste had spent since she was 22 years old. She could not explain precisely why she drove home from it, feeling like something that had been tight across her chest for a very long time had shifted. Ronan noticed the shifts in her, because he noticed things, because noticing was built into him so deeply that he probably couldn't turn it off if he tried. He didn't comment on most of what he noticed, which was one of the things she had come to appreciate most specifically about him. He observed without narrating, which left her room to figure things out in her own time, without the pressure of someone watching her figure them out. But he was not without his own shifts, and she noticed those too. He laughed more. Not performatively, Ronan Vale's relationship with performance was non-existent. He had no use for it, but genuinely, with the slight surprise of a man rediscovering something he'd assumed he'd lost access to. He laughed at Tessa's deliberate mispronunciation of words she knew perfectly well, at the cat from the neighbor's yard who had apparently decided the back porch was sovereign territory, and nobody had the standing to dispute this, at Celeste's genuinely terrible attempt to follow a recipe she'd found online that claimed to take 30 minutes and took her an hour 40, and produced something that was technically edible. "This is fine," Tessa said, eating it with diplomatic focus. "It's not fine," Celeste said. "It's character building," Ronan said. "That's what people say about things that aren't fine." He was laughing by then, and Tessa was laughing, and Celeste was not laughing, because the pasta was genuinely bad, and she had made it, and that was a fact. But the edges of her mouth were doing something involuntary, and she looked at the two of them, the man and the girl, laughing in a kitchen over terrible pasta on an ordinary Wednesday, and the involuntary thing at the corners of her mouth completed itself. She had not laughed at something in her own life in a very long time. She hadn't noticed until she did it. Declan Marsh called on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after their meeting in the coffee shop. Ronan took the call in Celeste's office, which he'd been using when she was in meetings, because the logistics of his role had evolved to the point where the glass-walled office down the hall was mostly symbolic anyway. He was on his feet when Celeste came back in from a 40-minute legal briefing, and she read his posture immediately. "They have enough," she said. "They have enough for both," he said. "Hale and Goss. The financial trail to Hargrove is documented completely, and the archive gave them the operational connection. Goss had been feeding scheduling information for 3 months before the kidnapping. Hale managed the camera infrastructure. They worked separately and never communicated directly, which is why it took longer." She put her bag down on the desk. "Who authorized the mercenaries?" "A Hargrove operative 2 layers removed from anyone in their executive structure. They're pulling that thread now. But the primary targets are Hale and Goss, and those are solid." "When?" "Marsh said they'd move within the week. He wanted me to tell you to be prepared for it to be public. When they're taken in, it'll move fast." She sat down in the chair across from her own desk, the visitor's chair, the one she'd put there for other people, and looked at the floor for a moment with her hands on her knees. Raymond, she said. Yes. Does he know that it's coming? No way to know. But Marsh said his behavior has changed in the last week. He's been taking longer lunches, coming in late. It may be that some part of him has been waiting for this. She was quiet. Outside the glass wall, the executive floor moved in its ordinary rhythms, assistants crossing with documents, two people conferring near the printer, someone laughing at something on their phone. The machinery of the company, running on its regular tracks, unaware of what was about to detonate inside it. I need to tell the board chair before it goes public, she said.
Yes.
And legal today, I'd say. She looked up at him. After it's done, after they're charged, I'm going to hold a shareholders meeting. He had been expecting something, but not this quite yet. You don't have to do that immediately. I'm not doing it because I have to, she said. I'm doing it because there are things I need to say in public that I should have said a long time ago, and the timing is going to be right. She paused. I want you there. At the shareholders meeting. On the stage. With me. He looked at her. I'm not going to keep hiding you, she said. I kept you invisible for 3 years because I didn't see you, and then I kept you invisible because it was easier, and I'm done with easy. Her voice was level. You saved my life. You did it twice if we're counting correctly, and we are. The people who work for this company and invest in it and care about its integrity deserve to know who's been standing next to me. Celeste, I'm also going to apologize, she said. Publicly. I'm not performing this. I'm not building a narrative. I just need to do it correctly. And correctly means in front of the people who were watching me treat you like you weren't there. He stood across the desk from her and looked at the woman who had walked through his house 3 months ago with the careful attention of someone conducting an assessment, and who had painted a shed dark green because an 8-year-old thought it looked more outside that way, and who had made spectacularly bad pasta and laughed about it, and who was now sitting in a visitor's chair in her own office, telling him she was done hiding him. You don't owe me a public apology, he said. I know, she said. That's not why I'm doing it. Then why? Because I want to, she said. Because it's true, and I want to say true things. She looked at him steadily. And because I've been thinking about what comes after this, after the investigation, after the charges, after the shareholders meeting. I've been thinking about what I want to build next, and I don't want to build it on something I left unfinished. He was quiet. You worked every day in a building where you were effectively invisible, she said. You watched over me for 3 years without asking for one thing. You came into a warehouse in the middle of the night and got me out of it, and then you drove me home in a car with a stuffed rabbit in it, and you didn't say I told you so, or you owe me, or anything. You just said, do you want coffee? She paused. That needs to be said out loud, where people can hear it. Not for your sake. For the record. He thought about what he was going to say, and then said it plainly. You're making it hard to keep the right amount of distance. Good, she said. I was trying to. He almost said something about that, and then didn't, because there were things that weren't ready yet, and he knew it, and he thought she knew it too, and neither of them was in a rush. They arrested Douglas Hale on a Thursday morning at 8:47 in the lobby of the federal building where he'd been summoned for what he'd been told was a routine contract security review. He had apparently understood in the first 30 seconds what was actually happening, because he hadn't fought it. He'd sat down in the chair they offered him and asked for a lawyer, with the exhausted compliance of someone who had been waiting for this particular Thursday for several months. Raymond Goss was different. Marsh called Ronan at 9:15, while the news about Hale was still circulating through the executive floor in the particular fast-moving whisper pattern of institutional shock. Goss isn't at his office, Marsh said. He called in this morning saying he had a medical appointment. We have people at his home. He's not there either. His car is gone. Ronan was already on his feet. He's running. We have his plates. He won't get far. Where would he go? Ronan said, thinking aloud. He doesn't have offshore resources. You've established that. He doesn't have anyone to run to on the Hargrove side. They'll burn him before they help him. He's panicked, and he's driving, and he has no destination. That's our read too, Marsh said. We want to know, is there anywhere that had significance to him? Relative to the company. Relative to Armitage. Ronan thought. There's a property. Outside the city. About 90 minutes north. It was Marcus Armitage's country estate, the family property. It's been in the estate since Marcus died. Unoccupied. Goss would have known that property. He spent time there with Marcus. A pause. Why would he go there? Because people who are running without a plan go somewhere that feels safe, Ronan said. And that place was safe for him once. He told Celeste in her office in 4 sentences. Her face did something complicated and brief. He's going to my father's house, she said. It's a guess. It's a good guess. She was already reaching for her jacket. I'm coming. Celeste, he worked for my father for 18 years, she said. If he's going to be found somewhere that mattered to my father, I'm going to be there. She looked at him. I'm not asking to run the operation. I'm not going to interfere. I'm going to be there. He looked at her for a moment, at the particular quality of determination she had that was not recklessness, but was also not going to be argued out of anything, and said, "Stay with me and do exactly what I say." "Yes," she said, and meant it. They found Raymond Goss's car parked outside the gate of the country estate at 11:43 in the morning. 2 federal vehicles were already positioned on the road when Ronan and Celeste arrived. Marsh was standing by the gate with his jacket open and his unremarkable face doing the thing it did when events were arriving at their conclusion. "He's inside," Marsh said. "Didn't break in, he had a key. He's been there about an hour. No indication of weapons. He hasn't responded to calls." He looked at Celeste. "Ms. Armitage." "He's not armed," she said. "Raymond doesn't have weapons. He's afraid." "We'll treat it as unknown until we know," Marsh said. "Standard approach." She nodded. She stood beside Ronan at the gate while Marsh's people moved toward the house, and she looked at the property she hadn't visited since her father's death, the stone facade, the old oaks along the drive, the retaining wall at the back of the property where a 14-year-old boy had once climbed down to hold her while she was unconscious and unable to know that he was there. She looked at the retaining wall and thought about everything that had started at that wall. All the threads that led from that one afternoon to this one. The strange long chain of events that connected a 7-year-old girl's accident to a courthouse marriage, to a midnight kidnapping, to a man standing beside her in a property that had belonged to the father who had quietly constructed all of it. "You okay?" Ronan said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I think so." Raymond Goss came out of the front door of the house at 12:07, walking slowly, with his hands where everyone could see them. He was in his regular work clothes dress slacks, a button-down shirt which looked, in the context of the property in the morning, like a man who had gotten dressed for an ordinary day and then found himself in a version of it he'd never planned for. He was escorted to the federal vehicle without incident. As he passed the gate, he saw Celeste. He stopped for one moment. Not long the agents kept him moving, but long enough to look at her with an expression she would not have been able to name if asked. It was not guilt, exactly, and it was not defiance, and it was not the exhausted compliance Hale had shown. It was something older and more complicated than any of those things. It was the face of someone who had loved the world this woman inhabited and had burned it anyway and knew it, and was out of reasons. She held his gaze. She didn't say anything. He was put in the car and the door closed, and that was the last time she saw Raymond Goss as a free man. She stood at the gate for a moment after the vehicle pulled away. "He really did love my father," she said. "I think so," Ronan said. "That's not—" She stopped. Started again. "A person can love someone and still destroy what they built. Those 2 things can both be true." "Yes," he said. "They can." She turned away from the gate. The property sat in the late morning light, the old oaks holding their position with the patience of things that had been there long before any of this and would remain after. The retaining wall at the back caught the sun. She looked at it for a moment. "That's where you were," she said. "When I fell. Were you scared?" He considered. "I was 14, he said. "So yes. But there wasn't really time to be scared in any useful way. You were there, and I was there, and you needed someone to hold you still. So you did. So I did." She looked at the wall for another moment. The stone was old and slightly mossy on the north face, the kind of wall that was built to last, and had lasted, untroubled by the events that had happened around it. "My father stood at that wall," she said, "when the adults finally came. He would have seen you there." "He came down to me," Ronan said. He didn't wait for the others. He came down and he said he paused. He said, "I see you, son. I've got her now. You can let go." The morning was very quiet for a moment. "And you let go," she said. "And I let go," he said. She didn't say anything else about it. She walked back to the car and he followed, and they drove back toward the city with the investigation behind them, and everything else still ahead. The shareholders' meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks after the arrests, which gave legal enough time to prepare the official statement and gave Celeste enough time to write what she wanted to say herself, without a speechwriter, in 3 separate drafts that she threw out and one that she kept. She told the board chair, Evelyn Marsh, no relation to Declan, the full story in a meeting that ran 2 hours and covered everything she'd learned in the preceding months. Evelyn was 71, had served on the board since Marcus Armitage's second year of operation, and had the specific quality of long experience that didn't flinch at complexity. She listened to all of it, and at the end she said, "You're sure about the public acknowledgement?" "Yes," Celeste said. "The marriage will generate coverage." "I know. Some of it will be unkind."
I know.
Evelyn looked at her across the boardroom table. "You know what your father would say. He'd say do it correctly and don't apologize for being right," Celeste said. Evelyn smiled, which was rare enough to be its own event. "He'd also say you're more like him than you give yourself credit for." She picked up her pen. "I'll be there." The night before the shareholders' meeting, Celeste was at Ronan's house until late, sitting at the kitchen table after Tessa had gone to bed, with a cup of tea she wasn't drinking, and a printed copy of her speech that she was holding without reading because she had memorized it 3 days ago. Ronan was across from her, doing the maintenance work that accumulated in evenings, something involving a hinge from one of the kitchen cabinets, which he was addressing with the patient specificity he brought to anything that needed fixing. He didn't ask about the speech. He didn't ask if she was nervous. He just existed across the table from her with the cabinet hinge and his tools, which was exactly what she needed without having had the vocabulary to ask for it. "Ronan," she said. When you agreed to what my father asked the marriage, the arrangement, did you know it would go on this long?" He set down the hinge. "Thought about it. I knew I was agreeing to something open-ended. I didn't think about duration." "Exactly. Did you think about what it might become?" He looked at her. "No," he said. "I didn't let myself think about that." "Why not?" "Because you were a person who didn't know I existed," he said. "And thinking about what things might become when you're the only one who knows the other person. That's a particular kind of loneliness I didn't need." She absorbed this. "I know I exist now," she said. "Yes," he said, "you do. That changes the math." "It does," he said carefully. "I'm not," she stopped. Started again. "I'm not good at this part. I'm good at decisions. I'm good at knowing what I want and getting it. I'm not good at the in-between part, where you don't know yet and you're waiting to find out." "Nobody's good at that part," he said. "You're patient with it." "I've had practice being patient with things I couldn't control," he said. "It's not a virtue. It's just what happens when you learn the alternative doesn't work." She looked at him across the kitchen table, at this man who had been patient with a version of her life for 3 years without anyone asking him to, and who had come into a warehouse in the rain and cut her hands free and driven her home in a car that smelled like a child's shampoo. "I don't want to do the in-between part for very much longer," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, not dramatically, not with the theatrical quality she'd seen in other men when they were getting what they wanted. Just a settling. Like something that had been braced against a possibility was finally allowed to stop bracing. "Okay," he said. "That's it? You don't want a speech," he said. "You just told me something. I heard it." She looked at him. "Okay," she said. He picked up the cabinet hinge, turned it over in his hands, set it back down. "Get some sleep tonight," he said. "Tomorrow's a long day." "I know. You're going to be fine." "I know that too," she said. She meant it. It surprised her slightly that she meant it so completely, without the usual private asterisk, the qualification, the carve-out, the awareness of all the ways things could still go wrong. She meant it, the way she meant the things she was most certain of. She picked up her tea, finally. It was cold, but she drank it anyway. Outside, the city was doing its nighttime things, and in the back bedroom, Tessa was asleep with Sergeant Hopscotch restored to full structural integrity, standing upright on the nightstand, on duty. And in the kitchen, under the ordinary light, 2 imperfect people sat with a cabinet hinge and a cold cup of tea between them and the truth of what they were becoming. Quiet, and the morning of the shareholders' meeting arrived the way significant mornings often did without ceremony, looking almost identical to every other morning, as if the day hadn't gotten the message about its own importance. Celeste was up at 5:15, not because she'd set an alarm, but because her body had sleep was finished and she'd learned long ago not to argue with that particular decision. She made coffee in her kitchen, her penthouse kitchen, the one with the view and the imported stone counters, and the espresso machine that had cost more than Ronan's car, and stood at the window, watching the city come back to itself in the gray pre-dawn light, all those windows beginning to glow one by one as people started their ordinary days inside them. She thought about what she was going to say. She had the speech memorized. That wasn't what she was thinking about. She was thinking about the specific weight of the thing she was about to do, and whether she was doing it for the right reasons. and whether the right reasons were even the point, because sometimes the correct action and the self-serving action overlapped so completely that pulling them apart was more about ego than ethics. She had asked herself that question 3 times in the past week and arrived at the same answer each time. She was doing this because it was true, and because true things needed to be said in the register they deserved, and because 3 years of treating Ronan Vale as though he didn't exist in her life needed to be corrected in a setting that matched the scale of the error. That was not a comfortable answer. She said it to herself anyway. Her phone showed a text from Ronan, sent at 5:47. Tessa wants to know if you want her to wish you luck. She typed back, tell her yes. 3 minutes later, she says you're going to be great, and also that you should eat breakfast first. She looked at that for a moment. Then she went and made toast, because an 8-year-old had told her to, and because she had apparently reached a point in her life where she was taking advice from children and eating meals at tables with sticky patches and painting sheds dark green, and this was, she had come to understand, not a diminishment of who she was. It was an addition. The Armitage Vanguard annual shareholders meeting was held at the Callaway Center downtown, a venue used primarily for industry conferences and the occasional political event that needed the particular visual grammar of high ceilings and institutional carpet. By 9 a.m., the room was filled with the specific population that attended these things: major shareholders, board members, executive staff, institutional investors, with the carefully maintained expressions of people paid to be unreadable, and a contingent of financial journalists who had their phones out and their press passes visible and were already writing the top of their stories in their heads. The news of the arrests had broken publicly 4 days earlier. The story had been what Celeste's communications team had expected and managed accordingly: a defense technology company's internal conspiracy, a corporate rival's fingerprints on it, 2 senior employees in federal custody. The coverage had been aggressive and mostly accurate, which was the best outcome available. Armitage Vanguard stock had dropped 7% in the first day and recovered 4 of it by day 3, which legal and the board chair had described as a reasonably good result under the circumstances. Celeste sat backstage in a green room that smelled of old coffee and spray starch and watched the room fill on a monitor. Her communications director, a compact, precise woman named Helen Park, ran through the logistics one final time with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times, and knew that at a certain point, additional preparation was just anxiety in a suit. The press pool is to your left, behind the rope, Helen said. Don't look directly at them during the personal portions. It reads as performing, I know, Celeste said. The board chair will introduce you. Standard 2 minutes, then it's yours, Helen. Yes. Is Ronan in the building? Helen glanced at her tablet. He arrived at 8:15. He's positioned at the back right entrance. Can you ask him to be at the left side of the stage instead? Close to the steps, a brief pause. Of course. Helen made the call, and Celeste looked at the monitor, and the room continued to fill, and she sat with the last few minutes of before, in the way she sat with all high-stakes moments, straight-backed, quiet, letting her mind run through the material one final time, not because it needed the repetition, but because the ritual of it was its own kind of steadiness. She thought about her father. She did this less frantically now than she had in the first 2 years after his death, when thinking about him had carried the particular desperation of grief that hasn't found its shape yet. Now it was quieter. More like consulting someone whose opinion she trusted than trying to recover something she'd lost. He would have been in this room, she thought, sitting in the front row, probably with the deliberate expression of a man trying not to look too pleased with himself. He had built the company and handed it to her, and then handed her Ronan in that order, because he understood that the company was the thing she could manage alone, and Ronan was the thing she couldn't find alone and wouldn't have looked for. He had been right. She acknowledged this without resentment now. Being right about someone you love is its own kind of love, and her father had been fluent in that language in ways she was still learning. Evelyn Marsh introduced her in exactly 2 minutes, with the economy of a woman who had been in boardrooms for 40 years, and understood that what people remembered was never the introduction. Celeste walked out to the applause that happened at these things, not warm, not cold, the professional courtesy of a room that was waiting to see what she was actually here to say, and stood at the podium and looked out at 340 people and said, I'm going to start somewhere that's not on the agenda. The room adjusted. She could feel it, the subtle recalibration of attention from the prepared for to the unexpected. 14 weeks ago, I was abducted from the parking level of this company's headquarters. Most of you know the outline of that story because it became public in the last week. What you don't know is the full version, and I'm going to tell it to you now, because I have found that the full version of a true thing is always more useful than the manageable version. She told them what had happened in the parking garage, and the warehouse, and the car afterward. She told it without drama, in the plain register of something that had happened and was finished. She saw people in the room who had known the outline go still as the specifics arrived. The man who came into that warehouse was not a special operations unit or a security contractor or anyone my company had commissioned for emergency response, she said. He was a member of my security staff on his own time, with no authorization from any department and no expectation of recognition. He came because he had been watching over me for 3 years with the specific sustained attention of someone who had decided that protecting me was his responsibility, regardless of whether I acknowledged it. She paused. I had not acknowledged it. In 3 years of working in the same building, I had not had one real conversation with this man. I had not asked his name beyond what was on the employee roster. I had not looked at him not as a person, not as a human being with a history and a life and reasons for being where he was. I had looked through him, the way powerful people often look through the people standing next to them, because looking through is easier than looking at, and I had been too focused on everything I considered important to notice what I was actually doing. The room was very quiet. His name is Ronan Vale. He is a former Navy SEAL who served for 13 years and came home carrying what soldiers carry home from the kind of work that leaves marks that don't show on paperwork. He is a single father raising an 8-year-old daughter, who is, I can tell you from personal experience, one of the most honest and perceptive people I have encountered in 30 years of life. He is also, by legal record, my husband, an arrangement that began as a debt my father owed, and that I spent 3 years treating as an inconvenience. She looked up from the notes she wasn't reading. I would like Ronan Vale to come up here. The silence in the room was the specific silence of a crowd that has just been handed something they didn't know how to file. She watched Ronan come from the left side of the stage. He moved the same way he always moved, without performance, without adjustment for the audience, just a man crossing a stage and stand beside her. She looked at him. He looked back. Ronan saved my life the night he came into that warehouse, she said, speaking to the room but looking at him for a moment before she turned back. What most of this room doesn't know is that he also saved my life 23 years ago, when I was 7 years old and he was 14, and we were strangers. He held me on a retaining wall at my family's property until the adults came, and then he let go, and he walked away, and he didn't ask for anything. She turned to face the audience fully. He is the most capable, most honest, most quietly committed person I have worked alongside, and I use that phrase correctly now. Alongside, not above or around or in front of, in the entirety of my professional life. She let that land. I am telling you this because I owe him a public accounting that matches the private debt. I'm telling you this because the people in this room fund this company and trust its leadership, and you deserve to know who its leadership actually is and who stands next to it. And I am telling you this because I spent 3 years being wrong about something important in a way that cost a good person his rightful recognition, and I am not interested in letting that stand uncorrected. She looked at Ronan beside her and said not to the room, but in a voice the room could hear, I'm sorry. I should have seen you. I should have seen you from the beginning. He said nothing for a moment. She hadn't expected him to say anything. She hadn't done this for a response, but he said quietly in a voice that was not theatrical and not loud, I know. And then, because he was Ronan, you see me now. She yelled that. Then she turned back to the podium. Armitage Vanguard will emerge from this period with its contracts intact and its security infrastructure entirely rebuilt, she said, returning to the register of the CEO, because she was both things and always would be. The legal proceedings against Douglas Hale and Raymond Goss are ongoing, and we will cooperate fully and completely with the relevant authorities. Hargrove Defense Systems will face civil action in addition to whatever federal exposure their role generates. I am not interested in a managed outcome. I am interested in a complete one. She reached the final part of what she had written. Effective immediately, I am committing $20 million of my personal holdings to the establishment of a foundation. It will be called Second Horizon. Its purpose will be to provide comprehensive support to veterans returning to civilian life counseling, employment transition, family support structures, and mentorship programs designed by people who have done what these veterans have done and come out the other side. She paused. I am asking Ronan Vale to lead it, not because he needs something to do, and not as a gesture. Because he is the most qualified person I know for this work, and because the thing my father tried to teach me, that a person is not in their title or their visibility, is most honestly demonstrated not by saying it, but by acting on it. The applause started somewhere in the middle of the room and moved. It was not the polite, professional courtesy of the opening. It was the kind of applause that meant something had actually landed. She stepped back from the podium. Beside her, Ronan stood with the particular stillness of a man who was letting something in carefully, because he'd learned to be careful about what he let in, and she understood that, and she gave him the moment without commentary. The months that followed were not a clean resolution. Clean resolutions existed in the version of events people told later, when the difficult parts had been compressed by time, and the edges had been worn smooth by repetition. The actual months were messier and more ordinary and, in many of the specific moments that composed them, considerably better than any clean resolution Celeste could have constructed. The Second Horizon Sojin Foundation opened its offices in a converted warehouse on the east side of the city, a choice Ronan had made deliberately, because the east side was where the people he wanted to reach actually lived, and he had never had much patience for institutions that required the people who needed them to travel to where the institution was comfortable. He hired carefully and slowly, with the same methodical patience he applied to everything that mattered. He brought in 2 people from the veterans community he'd worked with informally over the years. He hired a family support coordinator who had spent 15 years in social work and had no military background but understood, Ronan said, how to talk to people who didn't want to talk. He was not a natural administrator. He knew this and said so, out loud to Celeste, in the first week, which was how she knew he was going to be a good director, because the people who admitted what they weren't good at were always more useful than the ones who pretended the gaps didn't exist. She helped him build the operational structure because that she could do in her sleep, and because helping him was something she had decided to be available for in the specific, concrete way, not in the distant, resource-allocating way she'd offered help to things before. She sat in the Foundation's offices on Tuesday evenings, which were not glamorous evenings, folding chairs, a coffee machine that worked intermittently, paperwork stacked on surfaces that were not quite enough for the amount of paperwork, and worked through the organizational architecture with him the way she worked through everything, directly, impatiently, correcting herself out loud when she got things wrong. He watched her do this, correct herself out loud the first time, with something in his expression that she couldn't immediately identify. She asked him about it later. You apologize to yourself, he said, out loud. When you get something wrong, you just say no, that's wrong, and move on. Is that unusual? Most people I've worked with don't say the wrong thing out loud, he said. They just quietly adjust and hope nobody noticed. Noticing is faster if you say it, she said. I know, he said. I'm not criticizing, I'm just. He paused. It's a good quality. She looked at him. You're getting better at saying things. I'm getting practice, he said. The Pentagon contract was finalized 11 weeks after the shareholders' meeting, with Armitage Vanguard as the primary contractor on a 6-year defense infrastructure project that was the largest single contract in the company's history. Celeste signed the documentation in a conference room with the relevant government representatives and her legal team and her board chair, and then she called Ronan from the parking garage, the same parking garage, though it had a completely rebuilt security infrastructure now, and cameras that had never been compromised, and told him. Congratulations, he said. My father would have been insufferable about this, she said. He would have acted modest for about 45 seconds and then found a way to work it into every conversation for a month. She could hear him smiling. She had learned to hear that. Sounds right, he said. Tessa has a school thing tonight, she said. The thing about the science project. The ecosystem diorama, he said. She's very serious about the ecosystem diorama. I know. I helped her with the seagrass section last week. I know more about seagrass than I ever expected to know. Welcome to the club, he said. She stood in the parking garage with her phone and the signed contract documents under her arm, and the rebuilt security cameras doing their quiet, reliable work above her, and she thought about standing in this same space 14 weeks ago with a black bag over her head, and the specific distance between that moment and this one. Distance was not the right word, actually. The 2 moments were not far apart in any way that mattered. They were threaded together by everything that had happened between them, And the thread was not a separation, but a connection: the warehouse and the sedan, with the stuffed rabbit and Tessa's homework, and the dark green shed, and the cold sub-basement server, and Raymond Goss's face at the gate, and a kitchen table at midnight with a cabinet hinge and a cup of tea. She had been through all of it. She had come out on the other side not lighter. She was not someone who believed in the mythology of burdens lifted and weights shed, but more accurately weighted. Carrying what was actually hers, and having put down what wasn't, which was a harder distinction than it sounded. "I'll see you at 6:30, she said. 6:30, he confirmed. She sold the penthouse in the spring. Not dramatically, not in one decisive gesture of symbolic transformation, but practically, because she had calculated the number of nights she actually spent in it over the preceding 4 months, and arrived at a figure that justified the decision on purely logistical grounds. She told this to Ronan in a way that made him give her the look, the slight, specific look he gave her when she was being not practical about something that was actually personal, and she acknowledged the look and said, "Fine." It was both. The house she bought was in a part of the city that was not quite where Ronan lived, and not quite where she had lived. It was 15 minutes from Tessa's school and 12 minutes from Armitage Vanguard's headquarters, and had a yard with enough room for a garden and a back porch with southern exposure and walls that were, when she moved in, completely bare. Tessa came to see it the first weekend and walked through each room with the seriousness of a structural inspector. "This room needs something on the walls," Tessa said in the hallway. "I know," Celeste said. "You could put your awards," Tessa said. "Or drawings. Drawings are better because awards just remind you of things you already did." Celeste looked at her. "That's a sophisticated point." "Dad says it," Tessa said, with the comfortable attribution of a child for whom her father's observations were simply facts about the world. "He says awards are for other people, and memories are for you." Ronan, who had come in from looking at the back porch, heard the last part and said, "From the hallway I also said that privately." "He says things privately, and then they're true in public," Tessa told Celeste. "I've noticed," Celeste said. They put drawings on the walls. Tessa's drawings, which were improving with the particular rapid acceleration of children, who find something they love and do it constantly. Horses that were starting to look like horses, and a series of what Tessa called portraits of Sergeant Hopscotch in various historical settings. Some of Ronan's photographs. 2 of Celeste's professional recognitions, at Tessa's insistence, because Tessa had decided that some amount of being reminded of things you'd done was good for you, and 2 was the right amount. The wall in the kitchen had a photograph of 3 people in a backyard, slightly out of focus, because Tessa had taken it herself and hadn't mastered distance yet. Celeste and Ronan standing in front of the freshly painted dark green shed, squinting into the afternoon sun, neither of them performing a smile, just caught in the actual moment as it was, Tessa's shadow visible at the bottom of the frame, where she was already moving back to check if she'd gotten it. The last Saturday of October was the kind of day the year saved for the end of itself, cold and clean, with a sky that had decided on blue with the conviction of a final statement. The leaves on the trees in the yard had committed to orange, and the ones that had given up were on the ground in the particular beautiful disorder of things that had let go at the right time. Ronan was at the kitchen table helping Tessa with a reading assignment that Tessa was processing with her customary combination of genuine effort and theatrical suffering. Celeste was in the doorway, still in her jacket from the afternoon, watching them. "But why does he have to leave?" Tessa said, about the character in the book. "Because staying would have cost him something he couldn't afford to lose," Ronan said. "But leaving costs him the thing he loves." "Yes." Tessa thought about this with the focused unhappiness of someone confronting the unfairness of a situation that has no clean resolution. "That's not a good story." "It's a true one," Ronan said. "True ones don't always end the way you want. Does it end the way it should?" Ronan considered. "I think the author thought so. What do you think?" He looked up from the book and saw Celeste in the doorway. He held her gaze for a moment with the particular quality of attention he brought to things that mattered, unhurried and complete. "Yeah," he said. "I think so." Tessa went back to the book, unconvinced but proceeding, because proceeding was what you did. Celeste came in from the doorway and put her jacket on the hook by the door and sat down at the kitchen table in the chair that had become her chair, in the way that things became yours, in houses where you were. Genuinely present rather than just passing through. She thought about what it meant to end the way things should. She had spent most of her adult life believing that outcomes were built from strategy, that the right moves, executed with sufficient precision, produced the intended result. She was not wrong about this in the domain where it applied. She was a very good strategist, and the company she ran reflected that, and she did not apologize for it. But she had learned she was still learning. It was not a finished education that there was a category of things that didn't respond to strategy. That couldn't be planned for because their value lived specifically in the unplanned parts, in the moments that arrived without being constructed, in the kitchens and the painted sheds and the cold server rooms and the drives through rain in cars that smelled like someone's life was actually being lived in them. She had spent 3 years with the life she had built and had not, in those years, felt genuinely at home in it. Not because the life wasn't good by any measurable standard. It was. She had known this and been vaguely unsettled by the gap between the knowing and the feeling, and she had filled the gap with work because work was reliable in a way that feelings were not. The gap was smaller now. She noticed this without making too much of it, because she had also learned that the impulse to declare things finished was often just impatience in formal wear. Things like this didn't finish. They grew and they changed, and they had difficult passages, and they came out on the other side of those passages different than they went in. She was 30 years old. She had time to learn the rest. Ronan, across the table, caught her looking at nothing and said, without looking up from the page, Tessa was pointing at, "What?" "Nothing," she said. "You have the thinking face." "I always have the thinking face. That's just my face." "There are different versions," he said. "That one is the version where you're working something out." She looked at him. "I was thinking about what you said, that the story ends the way it should." "And?" "And I was thinking that 3 years ago I would have told you that I don't believe in should," she said. "I would have told you that things happen, or they don't happen. And assigning value categories to outcomes is sentimentality." "You would have been annoying to argue with," he said. "I know, I was." She looked at Tessa, who had moved on from theatrical suffering to genuine absorption in the story, the way children did when a story finally got its hooks in. "I think I was wrong. I think there's a version of how things should go, and it's not a plan and it's not guaranteed, and you can miss it entirely by not paying attention. But when it's happening, you can feel that it's right. Not perfect." "Right." Ronan set the book down for a moment. Tessa, absorbed, didn't notice. "Yeah," he said, quietly. "You can." They looked at each other across the kitchen table, in the house that was learning to hold them, and outside the window the October light was doing the last of its afternoon work on the trees, and in the yard the leaves were orange, and the shed was dark green, and the world was continuing on its ordinary track around this one particular kitchen, where two people who had arrived at each other by an indirect and improbable route were sitting, with a child and a homework assignment, and the settled, unspectacular fact of having chosen to be exactly where they were. There are things I want to say about this, having sat with this story long enough to know its shape. We spend a lot of time talking about people who see us, who recognize us, who appreciate what we're worth, who give us the acknowledgement we've earned. And those things matter. Recognition matters. Being seen matters. But there is another side to that conversation that doesn't get as much attention. The cost of being the person who doesn't look. Celeste Armitage was not cruel. She was not malicious. She was someone who had decided, early and under understandable circumstances, that the world was a resource to be navigated rather than a collection of people to be known. That decision protected her in real ways and cost her in ways she didn't notice until she was standing in a warehouse with her hands tied, waiting to be rescued by a man she had never once looked at directly. We all have Ronans in our lives. Not necessarily ex-Navy SEALs with classified histories and a dead calm in crisis situations, but people who have been standing in our peripheral vision for years, steady and present and quietly remarkable, whom we look past because we're focused on the thing we've decided is the point. The point is usually not the thing we think it is. Ronan Vale did not save Celeste Armitage with his skill set, though the skill set was essential. He saved her with his consistency, with the daily unspectacular choice to show up and pay attention and keep his word, even when no one was watching and no one was going to say thank you. That kind of commitment is not glamorous. It does not generate headlines or performance reviews or the specific validation that people like Celeste had been trained to seek. It generates over time a life that can be trusted. And Tessa, 8 years old, checking that her father is in the kitchen before going back to sleep, saving him the bread because she knows he likes it. Not because she was taught to do these things, because she had a father who loved her with that same quality of daily, unspectacular commitment, and children learn from what they live inside. What Marcus Armitage understood what he saw in a 14-year-old boy holding his unconscious daughter on a retaining wall was not competence, though the boy had it. He saw the kind of person who stays when staying is hard, and lets go when letting go is right, and asks for nothing in the interval. He spent 23 years making sure his daughter would eventually know a person like that. It took her longer than he'd hoped. It always does. The danger was finished. The conspiracy was dismantled. The charges were filed, and the proceedings were grinding through the long, unglamorous work of institutional justice. And Second Horizon was open and doing the work of rebuilding lives. And Armitage Vanguard was intact and moving forward, and Ronan Vale's past was no longer something he carried alone in the dark. And in a kitchen in the middle of an ordinary Saturday in October, with leaves on the ground, and a child doing homework and 2 cups of coffee going cold because nobody remembered to drink them, a marriage that had begun as a debt between 2 men was finishing its long transformation into something neither of its participants had planned for, and both of them, finally, had chosen. Not because it was easy, not because it arrived without cost or complication, or the specific difficulty of 2 self-sufficient people learning to need each other without losing themselves in the process, but because the choosing was real, and the realness was the thing that made it last. Some things begin as obligation and become, over enough time and attention and honest reckoning, something that looks a lot like home. That, in the end, is what this story is about. Not the rescue, not the conspiracy, not the courtroom, not the boardroom. The kitchen table. Always the kitchen table.